A roster move buried in the transaction wire. A player's name disappearing from the lineup card without explanation. An organizational shift communicated through the neutral language of official statements that say everything and nothing simultaneously. And then there are decisions like this one. He's had enough. For words from the Dodgers general manager that landed in the baseball world like a demolition charge detonating beneath a building everyone thought was still standing. Not the careful organizational language of a front office managing a sensitive personnel situation with maximum diplomacy. Not the measured, qualified, legally vetted statement that professional sports organizations deploy when they need to communicate something difficult without creating consequences they cannot control. 4 words. Blunt. Final. Delivered with the specific directness of an executive who had made a decision, stood behind it completely, and was not interested in softening its edges for anyone's comfort. Roki Sasaki was being demoted to the minors. Not optioned down as a developmental measure. Not assigned to AAA as a temporary workload management strategy that would resolve itself within weeks when the roster situation clarified. Demoted. With the specific language of an organization that had reached the end of its patience with a situation that had been building longer than the public knew and had finally produced something that the front office could not absorb and move past without action. The ban from starting was simultaneous. Sasaki would not take the mound as a major league starter until the organization determined, on its own timeline, through its own evaluation process, that the conditions warranting the demotion had been sufficiently addressed. The baseball world processed the announcement with the immediate, loud, multidirectional energy that significant roster decisions generate when they involve players whose situations have been closely watched. Questions arrived faster than answers. The transaction wire confirmed the move. The media requests flooded the Dodgers communications staff. The speculation about what had actually happened, what specific events, beyond the public record of recent performances, had produced a decision this dramatic, began immediately. And then Roberts sat down in front of the cameras. And the secret he revealed changed everything. This is the ordinary condition of covering a professional sports organization, the gap between what the public record shows and what the internal reality contains. Sasaki's recent performances had been documented. The mechanical issues, the pitch tipping that Will Smith had confirmed, the losses that had accumulated during a stretch of starts that fell significantly below the standard the Dodgers had expected when they committed to him, all of this was known. All of this was part of the public conversation about why the organization might have reached the decision it reached. But the public conversation was missing something. Something that Roberts had been carrying since it happened, a specific piece of information about what had occurred during a recent game that had not been disclosed at the time and that the organization had managed internally without public acknowledgement. The 5-inning game. Roberts revealed it with the directness of a manager who had decided that protecting the information any longer served no purpose, that the demotion announcement had already initiated a process of public examination that would eventually surface what had happened anyway, and that getting ahead of it was better than allowing it to emerge through the kind of fragmented, partial disclosure that creates more confusion than clarity. Sasaki had given up during a game. Not in the metaphorical sense that athletes sometimes give up, the gradual withdrawal of effort that shows up in performance metrics and body language but never produces a single definitive moment of explicit surrender. In the literal sense. After 5 innings. With the game still in progress, with teammates still competing, with the organizational expectation of professional commitment still fully in place. He had told Roberts he was done. Not injured. Not experiencing the specific physical distress that would justify a pitcher removing himself from a game through the ordinary mechanism of telling his manager that his body requires it. Done in a different sense. A sense that Roberts, even in the careful language he used to reveal it publicly, left no ambiguity about. Sasaki had decided, in the middle of a professional baseball game, that he was finished for the day. And he had communicated that decision to his manager not as a request or a concern but as a statement. A fact. Something that had already been decided internally before it was expressed externally. Roberts had pulled him. The game had continued. The bullpen had absorbed the innings that Sasaki had declined to pitch. And the organization had carried what had happened internally, managing it through the private channels of professional baseball's accountability structures, until the demotion made continued internal management impossible. The media room absorbed Roberts' revelation in silence. Then the questions began arriving faster than he could answer them. Organizations make decisions about when to disclose information with the same strategic calculation they bring to every other significant decision. The Dodgers front office had known what happened in that 5-inning game since it happened. The decision to disclose it now, in conjunction with the demotion, was a choice, a deliberate organizational decision to provide context for the action being taken that would make the action comprehensible to the public in a way that the demotion alone might not. Without the revelation, the demotion would have been interpreted primarily through the lens of performance, a pitcher whose recent results had fallen below the standard the organization required, being sent down for additional development and mechanical refinement. A story that, while significant, fits within a familiar framework that the baseball world processes and moves past relatively quickly. With the revelation, the demotion became something different. It became the organizational response to a specific act of professional disengagement, a pitcher removing himself from competitive obligation in a way that the team's standards, and the standards of professional baseball broadly, do not accommodate regardless of how talented the player involved might be. The GM's 4 words, "He's had enough," acquired new meaning in this context. They were not just a characterization of a performance situation that had reached an organizational tipping point. They were a response to a specific moment in a specific game where Sasaki had communicated, through his actions, that he had had enough first. Before the organization reached that conclusion. Before the front office made the call. Before the transaction wire carried the announcement. Sasaki had withdrawn from the commitment that his professional role required. And the organization had responded in kind. But enough of it has been described, by enough people who were present in the building across the hours that followed, that the broad outline of the internal situation is reconstructible. Sasaki was informed of the demotion through the proper organizational channels before the public announcement was made. This is standard procedure. Players learn about transactions affecting them directly from the organization before those transactions appear on the wire. The conversation that delivered the news was not comfortable. Conversations of this kind never are. His reaction moved through stages. The initial processing of information that reshapes a professional reality in ways that require time to fully absorb. The specific quality of silence that arrives when a player understands that what is happening is not a temporary adjustment but a significant organizational judgment about his standing and his professional conduct. And then something happened that the building was not prepared for. Sasaki directed his anger outward. Not at the organization alone. Not at Roberts, whose revelation of the 5-inning game had transformed the demotion from a performance decision into something with a more specific and more damaging public narrative. Not at the GM whose 4 words had announced the decision with a bluntness that left no room for face-saving interpretation. He directed it at Otani. The specific nature of what Sasaki said, the accusation, the blame, the decision to point at his teammate as a contributor to the situation that had produced the demotion, has been described in fragments by people who were in proximity to it. The full content is not publicly documented. But the substance has been confirmed consistently enough across enough separate accounts that its broad outlines are not in dispute. Sasaki believed that Otani's presence in the organization, the gravitational pull of his magnitude, the way organizational attention and resources and priority distribute themselves around a player of his significance, had contributed to the conditions that produced his own struggles. That competing for organizational focus and coaching attention and the specific support structures that pitchers require in the space of a rotation that contains Otani had disadvantaged him in ways that the organization had not adequately acknowledged or addressed. He said this. In the building. Where people heard it. And then he took off his uniform. Because professional athletes in distress express that distress in ways that are specific to their environment, to the physical space of a clubhouse, the equipment that defines their professional identity, the objects whose symbolic weight becomes most apparent in moments when the professional reality those objects represent is being stripped away. Sasaki tore his jersey. Not the careful removal of equipment at the end of a game. The specific, physical expression of a frustration and a grief and an anger that had exceeded the capacity of words alone to contain. The jersey, the physical embodiment of the organizational affiliation that the demotion was in the process of redefining, became the object that received what could not be directed anywhere else cleanly. Players who witnessed it have described the moment with consistent words. Painful. Raw. The specific vulnerability of a young professional whose career trajectory has just been violently redirected, watching his own response to that redirection and being unable to fully manage it. Nobody intervened immediately. Not because they did not care. Because they recognized, from experience, that some moments of professional pain require space before they can receive response. That the impulse to immediately comfort or redirect can sometimes interfere with the process of a person fully arriving at the reality of what has just happened to them. The space was given. The moment passed. The jersey was what it was. And the accusation against Otani remained in the room. This detail matters because it shapes the way the accusation reached him, not directly, in real time, with the full emotional charge of the moment still present and requiring an immediate response. But second-hand. Through the people who had been there and whose accounts carried the substance of what had been said without the specific heat of the moment in which it was said. He received it with the same processing quality that characterizes how he receives all difficult information. Not immediate reaction. Not the performed composure that is actually suppression wearing a professional mask. Genuine absorption, the real-time integration of new information into an existing understanding of a situation, with the honest acknowledgement of what the information means and what it does not mean. What it meant was that a teammate, in a moment of significant professional pain, had looked for somewhere to direct that pain and had landed on Otani's name. Had found, in the frustration of a demotion and a public revelation and a career moment that felt catastrophic in its immediate weight, a narrative that placed partial responsibility for his situation at the feet of the player whose presence in the organization had most significantly defined the environment Sasaki had been competing within. What it did not mean, what Otani understood with the quiet clarity that characterizes his assessment of difficult situations, was that the accusation reflected a considered, stable judgment about responsibility and cause. It reflected pain. The specific, distorted perception of a person in crisis reaching for explanations that the distance of time and stability might produce very differently. He did not respond publicly. He did not issue a statement or seek out media availability to address what had been said about him. He did not direct any communication toward Sasaki, not through intermediaries, not through the organizational channels that professional athletes use to communicate with each other when direct communication is complicated by circumstances. He waited. Because some situations require waiting more than they require response. The media examination of Sasaki's recent starts, conducted with the specific attention of journalists who now had a confirmed framework for what had been happening beneath the performance numbers, produced a body of analysis that the organization had not fully anticipated when it made the decision to disclose what happened. Pitch-by-pitch sequences were re-examined. The specific innings across multiple starts where Sasaki's stuff had declined and his command had deteriorated were reviewed with the question of competitive disengagement as an analytical frame rather than a purely mechanical one. The numbers that had been read as evidence of a pitcher going through a rough stretch were being reread as something potentially different, as evidence of a pattern that the 5-inning admission had made newly visible. This is the specific risk of disclosure in professional sports. Information does not stay contained within the context in which it is released. It travels into every adjacent conversation, every related examination, every historical analysis that can be retroactively reframed by the new understanding the disclosure produces. Roberts had released a piece of information that he believed was necessary to provide context for the demotion. That information was now providing context for much more than the demotion. The pitching staff was aware of this. The coaches who had worked with Sasaki through the mechanical issues, through the pitch tipping correction, through the developmental challenges of a young pitcher adapting to major league competition for the first time, they were watching their work being reinterpreted through a lens that they had not anticipated and that was not entirely fair to the complexity of what they had been managing. They said nothing publicly. This is the professional discipline of coaches in organizations under scrutiny. They continued their work. They focused on the next start, which would now belong to someone else. They directed their attention forward with the institutional resilience of people who understand that the season does not stop for the stories it generates. He's had enough. In the days following the announcement, those words were examined from every direction. Their directness. Their finality. The absence of the diplomatic cushioning that most organizational statements deploy when significant personnel decisions are being communicated. What they revealed about the front office's emotional relationship to the situation, the specific exhaustion that had enough implies, the accumulated weight of a situation that had been managed internally for longer than the public knew before the decision to act was reached. Some read them as harsh. As an organizational communication choice that, whatever its honesty, added unnecessary public humiliation to a demotion that was already difficult enough without the GM's 4 words framing it as the organizational equivalent of a frustrated parent losing patience with a child who has tested the limits one too many times. Others read them as appropriate. As the honest expression of an organizational position that sanitized language would have obscured, a front office saying clearly, in the only terms that communicated the full weight of what had occurred, that the situation had exceeded the boundary of what the organization was prepared to continue absorbing. The debate itself was revealing. Because he's had enough does something that careful organizational language does not do. It makes the human dimension of the decision visible. It acknowledges that behind the transaction wire and the official announcement and the professional machinery of a roster move, there are people who have been dealing with something, managing it, carrying it, attempting to resolve it through the proper channels, and who have reached the end of what that management can accomplish. That human dimension is real. Whatever judgment is applied to the decision to express it so directly, its reality is not in dispute. The physical relocation that a demotion requires, the equipment transfer, the departure from the major league facility, the arrival at a different organization of the sport's developmental structure, produces a transition that is both logistical and psychological. The logistics are manageable. They have been managed by players before and will be managed by players again. They are uncomfortable but finite. The psychological transition is slower. The process of recalibrating a professional identity that had been oriented toward major league competition, of finding the motivation and the focus that development requires when the context for that development is the acknowledged consequence of falling short, of separating the work that needs to happen from the pain of the circumstances that made the work necessary, this takes longer than the drive to the new facility. Sasaki would do this work. He is a professional. Whatever the specific events of the days preceding the demotion had revealed about the limits of his professional composure under maximum pressure. He would go to the minor leagues and he would pitch and he would make the mechanical corrections and the competitive adjustments that the organization's evaluation process identified as necessary. Whether the accusation he had directed at Otani would remain part of his internal narrative through that process, whether the blame he had reached for in a moment of professional crisis would persist as a genuine conviction or dissolve in the distance and the perspective that time and work provide, is something only he can know. But the work would happen. It always happens, for players with talent and professional ambition. The minor leagues are where the work happens when the major leagues have determined that the work is not yet complete. The demotion was necessary. The 5-inning revelation was honest. The GM's 4 words were direct. Robert's disclosure served the organizational purpose he intended it to serve. The accountability that the situation required was delivered through the mechanisms that professional baseball provides for delivering it. And underneath all of it, beneath the transaction announcement and the press conference revelation and the torn jersey and the accusation and the 4 words that defined the story's public framing, there is a player who is 23 years old, competing in a country where the language and the culture and the competitive environment are all different from everything he knew before he arrived, carrying the weight of expectations that a significant contract and a significant organizational commitment place on a young pitcher who has not yet fully developed the tools to meet them. That player tore his jersey in a moment of professional crisis. He directed blame at a teammate in the distorted perception of a person in pain. He gave up on a game after 5 innings in a moment that his organization will not quickly forget. He also has extraordinary talent. The kind that organizations commit to, even when the commitment produces difficult days, because the ceiling of what the talent can become is worth the difficulty of the journey toward it. The demotion is not the end of the story. It is a chapter. A painful, public, organizationally consequential chapter in a career that will continue, in the minor leagues, and eventually elsewhere, wherever the work of development leads. The GM said he'd had enough. He meant it for today. Tomorrow is a different calculation entirely.